Another seat we got. Angela, have you got a seat for Robert?
Robert High will be here tomorrow. Oh,
Good afternoon, Robert. Thank you. Thank you, Angela. At the beginning of any meeting, the chair needs to remind all the members of their duty to avoid conflicts of interest and inquire as to whether any member knows of any conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest with respect to matters to come before the commission. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or potential conflict, please state when the roll is called. Angela?
Jay Cahoon.
Present, no known conflicts.
Neil Andrew.
Present, no known conflict.
Larry Baldwin.
Present, no known conflict.
D.R. Bryan.
Present, no known conflict.
Bob Emery.
Present, no conflict.
Jordan Hennessy.
Present, no known conflict.
Robert High.
Present, no known conflict.
Sheila Holman.
Present, no known conflict.
Steve King. Lawrence Alder.
Present, no conflicts.
Steve Shuttleworth.
Present, no known conflicts.
Earl Smith.
Present, no known conflicts.
Robbie Yates.
Present, no known conflicts.
That's 13.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Dare County. It's good to be here, especially during Earth Week. I'd like to thank our host, Bobby Outen and the County of Dare for allowing us to use this facility, and our staff is really envious of your technology. They wish they could take it with them and have it at every meeting, but thank you very much. We appreciate it. I'd like to welcome Deputy Secretary Bill Lane to our meeting. Thank you for coming in. I'd like to thank Philip Reynolds for sitting in for Mary. He's our attorney for this meeting. Mary is not available. And also, before you at your place will be, please note that there is a CV for Dr. Reed Corbett that has been sent to us. Dr. Moore, I'd like to thank her and the science panel for all their work on the sea level rise update, but even more, Dr. Moore, when she was first appointed, was challenged that if she had other people that she wanted to bring to the science panel and they had areas of expertise, to please let us know. I think this is the second time she has done so. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Corbett is head of coastal studies right here in Dare County, right down the road, heading towards Wanchese, not quite in Wanchese, but he does a great job down there, and we look forward to having this on our agenda for discussion. All right. Let's see, where are we? Right here. Okay. Matter of fact, next up would be approval of the February 2024 meeting minutes. Motion will be needed to approve the minutes with the amendments as requested.
I'll make a motion to approve the amended February meeting minutes.
There's been a motion on the floor by Commissioner Andrew. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Commissioner Holman. Any further discussion? Not all in favor? All opposed? Motion is carried. Next up would be the approval of the March 13th, 2024 special called meeting minutes. Is there a motion to that effect?
I'll make a motion to.
Motion by,
Yes.
Commissioner Baldwin,
I think I second that motion.
seconded by Commissioner Andrew. Any further discussion? All in favor? All opposed? So moved. We will be considering Dr. Corbett's CV later in the meeting. Next up, Bobby, Advisory Council report, please.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Dare County. Glad to have you all here. It's always nice to be home and have everybody here to do our business. So thanks for coming. Anything we can do to help, Madam Chairman, your staff has my staff's number, just call and we'll do whatever we can do to make it easier for you guys. So thanks for coming. At the CRAC meeting this morning, we had several things on the agenda or this afternoon. The first was a continued discussion of the CAMA land use plan. As you know, I think we've talked about before, we're in the process of amending the CAMA land use plan requirements. Michael gave us sort of a history of the plan today, took us through a lot of the proposed changes and the things that they wanted to do. They have done some input from the Coastal Resources Advisory Council. They've also done some input from our planners, and then they've done some survey work. And Rachel took us through that survey work and talked about, what they were hearing. They're going to do some more input on that. A lot of the survey work, you'd get 30% of the respondents didn't respond to a particular question. And so they want to go ahead and make sure that, we're doing this thing the right way and we get it all done on time, but done right as well. They took us through some of the changes. We had been through those as the CRAC before and had made comments on the various changes that they were going to make. And so as they do their input in the coming months, they're going to come back to us ultimately with some kind of proposed rules that we can then look at. When we get those and look at them, we'll come report to you with some recommendations before you all have to go through the process to adopt those rules as well. They're looking at roughly a 2025 timeframe. And I say roughly because they couldn't pin it down much better than that because of the input and the things that they need to do to get it through the process. So again, a very good presentation about that to keep us up to speed. There were some comments from our folks about that again, and so we'll see how that works out. Had some discussion on the straw bale rule development. You all have that on your agenda for later. Heather gave us a background on that. That began in 2000. The first straw bales were used in like 2015. They've been used since then at various times. A minor permit is required for that. They looked at various locations and various places that had been done. It's kind of mixed results depending on where you put them. In some places they work well, in other places they haven't worked so well. They talked about some of the science and some of the potential concerns or might be kind of concerns with permitting those kinds of things. From the Coastal Resources Advisory Council perspective, after hearing all that, having talked about these in previous meetings, our view is that we want to go ahead and have you move forward with adopting those rules, understanding that there may be need to make modifications. It's important to get them in place so we can start using the process, but we don't think they're perfect yet either, and we don't want perfect to get in the way of good. And so they have some concerns. There's some current concerns in there that the current rules are limited to local governments and homeowners associations that have some extended area of the beach, but a private individual couldn't go out and use straw bales for their properties. There's some concern about installation windows and why do we have windows when putting in a straw bale is less intrusive than putting in a sand fence. There was concerns that the rules as they're currently drafted had review requirements for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Resources, and where they have weighed in before and denied, the denials have been based on could or might or whatever, but not anything definitive on what those results were. And so there's concern about, that kind of review and denials that come from that. Some discussion about the ties that are around the bales, the rules require that those ties be removed. Again, the concern was those ties are less intrusive than the wire that's on a sand fence that's now allowed. So why are we removing ties here but allowing the wire that we have on sand fencing today? There's a provision in there that prevents staking, and if it allows you to stack the bales up to 3 feet high. Certainly if you have hay bales 3 feet high, you're going to have something to hold them in place. And we need to have staking, especially if you're taking away the ability to have the ties around the bales. And then the last thing is why are we limiting it to wheat bales? Why not other species of wheat? You're in an area where pretty much nothing grows, and so why not move forward with that? And so, again, the idea is let's move forward. Let's get some rules in place so we can start using the rules, but let's understand that there may be some modifications that need to be made. And as we work through them and people start using it, likely they'll be coming back to you to make those modifications. And so that was the recommendation of the CRAC, is to move forward, understanding those concerns and that we may need to come back in the future and modify them, but they did not want to delay the implementation of the rules to work through all of that. The last thing that we had on our agenda is we had some discussion about thin layer placement. Thin layer placement is the idea that you would put borrow sand in the marsh area to restore a degrading marsh. Two beneficial uses that come from that. One is we're struggling in lots of places to find an area to deposit the spoil area from the channels that we dredge throughout the state. And we have many of our marshes are degrading, and so there's an opportunity to use that sand to restore those marshes. We're kind of moving at a slow pace. There's some guidelines in place. Staff was unsure about the science and what the ramifications of doing it on a wide scale might be, and so we're kind of taking baby steps. And so we discussed that. There is a need for that. I would tell you that maybe it is done in other places, and maybe this is an opportunity for you to ask staff to look at where it's been done in other places, look at the science that has been done wherever it has been done. We don't have to reinvent the wheel if the science has already been done, and so that may speed the process up where we can get more streamlined rules and get this in use where it's needed and where it can be used. So that would be a request, if you will, for the staff. And that was it. Those were the things that we talked about, that we went through. That was a pretty long meeting and some pretty good discussion. As I've said before, you've got a cross-section of the coastal communities on your CRAC. We're here to help you. Please tell us how we can help you. Please tell us what you need us to help you think about. And we've got a group of people that don't mind sharing their views and don't mind going out in their communities to find out how things work and how people feel about them. So we're here to help you and let us. Any questions?
When you say thin placement, what are the ranges they're looking at as far as thickness when they say thin placement?
I don't know if I know the answer. I've got the guidance for site assessment and monitoring of thin layer placement projects in North Carolina that staff provided us, and so we can get you that, but I don't know if I know what the thicknesses are. Other questions? All right, thank
Bobby.
you.
Great report. We'll consider, don't leave yet. We'll take your recommendation into consideration tomorrow when we discuss straw bales, hay bales. And one other thing that CRAC has requested that staff investigate other places that look at thin layer placement. Is the commission comfortable with asking staff to go ahead and do that?
Yes.
I'm not seeing any dissension, so Tancred, if you would have staff take a look at thin layer placement in other states or communities and bring something back to the CRAC, and they can evaluate it and bring something back to us. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Your meeting was pretty well attended, and it was also, everybody was pretty participating well.
Good.
So
Thank
that's
you.
wonderful. Thank you very much. Tancred, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the commission. You have a packed agenda today and tomorrow, so I'll try to keep this one short for today. First of all, thanks again to our hosts, Bobby, Dare County, for making this space available to us again. I will say at the request of Commissioner Hennessy back in February, this is our first attempt to stream a commission meeting. So welcome to those joining us online, and hopefully this technology works for us. Thank you, Dare County, again for helping us get that figured out. Thanks to Christy, our PIO, who worked on this quickly with the team. We'll have Dr. William Sweet from NOAA, who will try to join us online to deliver his presentation on sea level rise. Your science panel chair, Dr. Laura Moore, she will lead that session this afternoon. She's joined by partners, Dr. Billy Sweet from NOAA, partners from NC State, UNC Chapel Hill, and SOCORA, the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association, SOCORA. They worked extremely hard on this update, and at the same time that they've been working on the IHA update. So their dedication to that voluntary state service truly is remarkable, and we appreciate everything that the panel does for us and you. As we continue to recognize the 50th anniversary of CAMA, we'll continue to highlight aspects of our program that serve the people and environment of coastal North Carolina. So tomorrow morning after your variance, we'll highlight the Resilient Coastal Communities Program with a staff update and reports from 2 program participants, Lynn Davis from Bellhaven and Meg Perry from SWC Consultants. As you're all aware, rulemaking continues to be a priority for us following the Rules Review Commission's return of 30 rules to us back in October. Tomorrow afternoon will be dedicated to rulemaking discussions, including a closed session to review the RSC's objection to 16 temporary rules last month. We'll also have an open session to review draft rules that we're proposing for permanent rulemaking. In some permitting news, since your February meeting, right across the road from where we are, DCM issued a permit to the Wanchese Marine Industrial Park to upgrade the O'Neill Seafood property. This included replacing the existing bulkhead, upgrading the offloading ramp to the docks, and other infrastructure upgrades. We also issued a permit on March 4th to the Coastal Reserves in Carteret County to construct an approximately 1,500 linear foot living shoreline around the Carrot Island end of the Rachel Carson Reserve in Beaufort. This consists of a wave attenuator, an inner oyster sill, and coastal wetland plantings, and will be completed in May if all stays on schedule. Funding for this project was provided by grants from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Land and Water Fund, and potentially some departmental funding as well. We've been working on preparing the permitting white paper that the Commission requested in your February meeting. We weren't able to complete it for this meeting, but we will strive to have it in time for your next meeting. We will be prepared tomorrow to discuss the timeline for agency comments on permit applications, as that is part of the rulemaking package for tomorrow. In November of last year, on the policy and planning side, planning staff presented 2 land use planning rule changes to the CRAC that you just heard about some more today. We had a workshop on March 14th with local government staff, 83 participants, 76% of those were from local governments. We submitted a pre-proposal to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund requesting $2 million to support planning grants to local governments for land use planning updates. And we're waiting to see if we'll be invited back for a full proposal on that. There were no land use plans certified since your February meeting. In resilience, speaking of the RCCP, the application period for our engineering grants as well as our construction grants is currently open. We're expecting to award approximately $6 million in engineering and construction grants this summer, with engineering awards ranging from $25,000 to $500,000 and construction grants ranging from $50,000 to $750,000. And there is no cash or in-kind match required for these grants. Application period closes on May 31st, and we had a webinar last week to answer questions from interested local governments and private sector partners. We are anticipating a decision soon on the grant proposal we submitted in February to NOAA's Climate Resilience Regional Challenge in partnership with the Coastal Federation. I saw Braxton sneak in a little while ago. There he is. The proposal was titled Coastal North Carolina Resilient Communities, Strengthening Nature and People Together, that includes $25 million for the RCCP and NCOR's RISE implementation projects featuring on nature-based solutions within socially vulnerable communities. In the coastal reserves, the reserve is hosting its spring local advisory committee, LAC meetings this month. Meeting information is available on the reserve's website. Spring student field trips to the Rachel Carson Reserve and the Masonboro Island Reserve via Island Explorer program are underway, and summer camps at the Rachel Carson Reserve will start in June in partnership with the North Carolina Maritime Museum. The Reserve and the WRC, Wildlife Resources Commission, are gearing up for the 10th annual Terrapin Tally to better understand the overall population status and condition of diamondback terrapins within the state. This is a citizen science project that takes a snapshot of the diamondback terrapin population in a given area by conducting kayak surveys at specified times and prescribed routes. Paddling routes are available at 11 protected areas along the central and southern coast, including reserve sites, and data collection will occur between April and June. The reserve is hosting a research symposium May 8th, 9th to highlight work conducted across multiple reserve sites with posters and presentations from researchers, including students, faculty, partner agencies, and staff. This is also an opportunity for the research community to network and provide input on future research priorities. Finally, actually a couple more things on the reserve side. The Discover the Coastal Reserve that was scheduled for April was rescheduled due to weather. It's now been being rescheduled for May. This tour is a multi-year campaign to connect target audiences with the program and its places. We hosted events at Currituck Banks Reserve and the Bird Island Reserve last year. CRC and CRAC members are invited to attend these Discover the Reserve events. Reserve and regulatory staff are hosting a Living on a Barrier Island virtual workshop for Outer Banks real estate professionals on May 21st from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Real estate professionals will earn 4 elective continuing education credits from the Real Estate Commission for participation. This workshop will cover how Barrier Islands are unique from an ecological and geological perspective, the rules and policies that govern development on Barrier Islands, updates to NFIP, and native plantings for the coastal landscape. To learn more, please contact Brittany Jenkins, our Coastal Training Program Coordinator. Finally, a few items in staff news. We are disappointed to announce that our DOT field representative for Region 1, Greg Daisy, will be leaving DCM on May 3rd after almost 10 years with the division. I don't know if Greg was here today. I don't think so. Okay. Greg has taken a position as an LPO with the town of Nags Head. So our loss is their gain, and we'll continue to be able to work with him in that capacity. Stephen Lane, who's our other DOT field representative, will take over Greg's territory. In good news, Phil DeAngelis has joined DCM as a field representative within our Wilmington regional office, covering southwestern Brunswick County. His first day was on Monday. Cameron Luck, who I think is here, he has moved into the Assistant Major Permit Coordinator for Infrastructure position back in March, taking on all infrastructure positions for the 20 CAMA counties. His move left a vacancy in the major permitting staff, which we anticipate filling very soon. Several interns and seasonal staff will be working with the Reserve in Mandio, Beaufort, and Wilmington this summer on a range of stewardship and education projects. Our thanks go to the Friends of the Reserve, the North Carolina Internship Program, and UNCW for their support and partnership for the internships. You can meet these interns and staff on the Reserve's website and social media once they start in May and June. In some more good news, we're in the process of implementing, at least partially for now, the salary increases indicated on the department's salary administration plan, bringing 32 more of our staff up to market competitive compensation levels. We hope this will help with employee satisfaction and retention. And we have 6 more staff members who are due for salaries adjustments, and we're working to get those completed as soon as possible. I would like to recognize today as Administrative Professionals Day. We have a very strong administrative staff within DCM. They do wonderful stuff for us, and they really help keep us moving in the right direction. So thank you to all the DCM's AP staff. Madam Chair, that concludes my report. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tancred. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Tancred?
I do, Chair Coon. Last meeting, you had mentioned there was a vacancy in the Northeast office. Have you filled that vacancy yet?
So Ron is here. He's a district manager. Ron has put in a recommendation for that position, and we hope to get that filled very, very soon.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we, next up on our agenda, hopefully the approval of Dr. Corbett to be appointed to the science panel. I know Angela sent it out, the CV out, and we also have at our place. Motion would be in order.
Madam Chair, I'd like to make a motion to approve David Corbett to the CRC Science Panel.
Been made by Commissioner Andrews. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Commissioner Holman. Any further discussion? He's going to be an excellent addition to the science panel. The science panel is doing excellent work right now, and he'll fit right in as well moving forward. So we appreciate the nomination coming forward. All in favor? All opposed? It is unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Moore, who's chair of our science panel, to talk about sea level rise context, impacts, and panel overview. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, Madam Chair, I can kick us off and introduce Laura and the rest of the team that's presenting today. So next slide, please. Just take you back to the charge that the CRC gave to the science panel for the sea level rise update. It was a different track than what they'd previously done with the first two reports, where rather than doing a lot of the heavy lifting on analysis, the staff came to you with a recommendation to limit the work that the panel did, since there are so many other agencies, both federal and state institutions and agencies working on sea level rise and putting out regular updates on sea level rise, both globally, nationally, and regionally. So rather than have them recreate that work, you all asked the science panel just to review what was done and come back to you annually with any information that's pertinent, relevant, or any gaps that exist for North Carolina. So that's what they've worked very hard to do over the last several months, and this is where we are. Next slide, please. So Dr. Moore is your science panel chair. I'm not going to read the entire introduction. You can see it there. She's obviously very well qualified, and it has been great for the staff to work with in that role. The other members of the science panel are listed here. I think I can take off that little asterisk now under Reed Corbett's name, now that he's official. Welcome, Reed. And you know, it's been a great team. You'll see representation from academia, from federal agencies, Spencer, who's now retired from Sea Grant. And it really remains the focus on who are the state experts in coastal processes, engineering, and geology. So great team, and thank you all for appointing Reed to join that group. Next slide, please. Your other presenters today, first after Dr. Moore, you'll have Dr. William Sweet. He again is on the federal level, I think probably the go-to person on sea level rise, and you can see just a few of his credentials listed here in his bio. There's a lot more to it, but you'll hear from him, and hopefully that technology works as well. Dr. Catherine Nenardi is here. She'll be presenting as well. She and her co-presenter, who you'll see in the next slide, are doing a lot of work on the sunny day flooding. So Dr. Miyuki Hino from UNC Chapel Hill, they've been doing monitoring work across multiple locations along the coast, looking at the sunny day flooding, which is a separate but related aspect of sea level rise that people tend to see more in the day-to-day lives. That I'll let them handle that discussion. Finally, today on this afternoon, you'll hear from Jennifer Dorton, Socorro. I won't try to say that name out again, but Jennifer's been with Socorro now for a couple of years, I think, and she's been previously in different roles in the state. She knows North Carolina really well, and working hard on expanding their ocean observing system with flood monitoring in North Carolina. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Moore.
Thank you. A quick question. Is it possible for me to advance slides from here, or is that? We're doing it in the back. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Tancred, and good afternoon, Chair Cahoon and Commissioners. It's a pleasure to be here representing the science panel and providing a summary of our 2024 sea level rise update as part of this session on sea level rise. And thank you to those who've agreed to join me here today. Next slide. To give you a sense of where I'm headed in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to start with a little bit of terminology and history. to provide a bit of context and then remind us why North Carolina is so vulnerable to sea level rise. I'll then summarize the highlights of the science panel update, which are drawn from the latest sea level rise report provided by the multiple agencies and led by Dr. William Sweet, who's here to provide more detail. And for the balance of my time, I'll provide an overview of the primary impacts of sea level rise on the North Carolina coast. Next slide. As many of you know, when considering sea level rise, it's important to distinguish between global mean sea level and relative sea level. Global sea level, also called eustatic sea level, is driven by changes in the amount of ice stored on land and the temperature and salinity of the ocean water itself, which affects its density and volume. Warmer water simply takes up more space. In addition to these changes, sea level in any one location, which we call relative sea level or local sea level, varies because of other factors that are different from place to place. These include dynamic factors such as ocean currents and factors that affect the vertical motion of the land, such as isostatic adjustments, tectonics, and the withdrawal of groundwater or other resources. So when we talk about sea level rise in North Carolina, we're referring to relative sea level rise. Next slide. And it's important to keep in mind that sea level is both what the ocean is doing and what the land is doing. So in North Carolina, our coast is especially vulnerable to sea level rise because much of the eastern portion of the state, of course, is made up of estuaries, marshes, and barrier islands. These environments form at sea level and are maintained by processes that occur at the boundary between land and sea. For example, marsh grasses are adapted to the salty conditions in the intertidal zone, and they grow by capturing sediment from ocean water. Barrier islands form and are maintained by processes that the action of waves and the actions of storms. And we could say where there's been sand, there's been water, and there's likely to be water again. The upward growth of marshes and barrier islands where this is allowed makes coastal systems resilient to sea level rise. Next slide. Although it's natural for us to think short term on the scale of a few years or a decade or maybe two, when we talk about sea level rise, it's important to keep in mind that sea level is never constant and it has changed significantly over time. The map on the right is color coded by elevation. The reds and oranges represent all the land surface below about 8 feet in elevation. The star is Nag's Head, just to the east of where we're sitting today. On the left, we're looking at a plot of sea level rise over time from 24,000 years ago to present, with elevation shown on the y-axis. If we could click once, we can see that during the time, so forward slide, during the time of the last glaciation, last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, sea level was about 120 meters or 400 feet lower. And the shoreline was about 45 miles to the east of where Nag's Head sits today. In contrast, and not shown on the plot because it only goes back 24,000 years, during a warm period 100,000 years ago, the shoreline was 60 miles to the west of where Nag's Head sits today. The Suffolk Scarp actually marks this old shoreline. And you can click forward. That's the black line. And one more slide forward. So although we aren't expecting changes that are as dramatic as these distant times in the past, current and future sea level rise will shift the boundary between land and sea markedly, with significant impacts on our ability to maintain coastal living as we know it. Next slide. So what does the latest sea level rise science say about the future of sea level rise in North Carolina? Well, for our 2024 sea level rise update, the panel turned to the authoritative and comprehensive analysis undertaken by a multi-agency team led by NOAA's Dr. William Sweet and published in 2022. The report projects, if we can click forward, 1 to 1.4 feet of sea level rise by 2050 for the Southeast region, which includes North Carolina. Next slide. It's worth noting that the tide gauge observations now show an acceleration in sea level rise. And there's agreement between tide gauge observations and model scenarios that lends confidence to this estimate that we'll see at least a foot of sea level rise by 2050. And if we can click again, thinking a little longer term, we're on track for a sea level rise of 2 to 7 feet by 2100. These projections are less certain because they rely heavily on the amount of ice lost from Greenland and Antarctica, and that is directly related to emissions. And since emissions are unclear, that degree of ice loss is not yet clear. We're fortunate to have Dr. Sweet here with us today, and he will go into more detail about this. If we can click forward again, it's important also to remember, as I already mentioned, that relative sea level varies from place to place. And within North Carolina, the rates of sea level rise, relative sea level rise, are higher in the northern part of the coast relative to the south. And these plots here, Dr. Sweet will go into in more detail. He was generous enough to run some projections specific to North Carolina that he will go into shortly. All right, so now I'm just going to turn for the balance of my time and switch gears a bit to share a general overview of some of the different types of impacts that sea level rise is having and will have on the North Carolina coast. I heard a colleague say this week that this isn't a future problem, this is a now problem. And this is really an excellent way to put it because many of these effects are already happening, as you'll see, shown by Dr. Nardi and Dr. Hino. But we can expect them to become more challenging to address in the future and for these impacts to worsen over time. And because our communities and roads are necessarily built at fixed elevations, sea level rise will initially be felt as increases in the frequency and extent of flooding. This includes high tide flooding and storm flooding. And there are also several other impacts which I will summarize, which include increases in shoreline erosion rates, a rising water table, and saltwater intrusion. So we can go forward to the next slide. I'm going to start with increases in high tide flooding, which again will increase in frequency and extent as tides propagate on higher and higher water levels. We also call this sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding, though I've always felt that nuisance flooding was a bit of a misnomer because this is certainly more than a nuisance for the businesses and the residents that are impacted. The graphic shown here from NOAA illustrates that at a lower sea level, if you look on the lower left, at a lower sea level about 70 years ago, it required a storm surge to reach the same levels, water levels that we now reach today just during high tide, which is why we're seeing this increase in high tide flooding. So we simply need the occurrence of high tides to get the same water level rise that storms were required to produce 50 years ago. And this is leading, next slide, of course, to the prevalence of water overtopping roadways, coming up through storm drains. When that occurs, what we're seeing is a reversal of flow and water from the ocean coming into communities through the drain system that is, of course, intended to carry water in the other direction. Shortly, you'll hear Dr. Sweet share his analysis of what we can expect in terms of the frequency of high tide flooding, and Drs. Zanardi and Hino will provide an overview on their work measuring high tide flooding throughout the coast of North Carolina, and Jennifer Dorton will talk about a monitoring network that's also monitoring changes in flooding. Next slide. In addition to increases in high tide flooding, storm flooding will also increase in frequency and extent. So just as high tides are propagating on higher water levels, storm surge is propagating on higher water levels. The USGS has recently put out a report that is available online, and they have provided an analysis of storm flooding for the Southeast US, state by state, location by location, under different future sea levels. And so what I'm showing here is an image from that sea level rise viewer. This is, sorry, NOAA has a sea level rise viewer. The USGS, this is the coastal flooding tool, which looks at storm flooding. And what they're showing here is the flood extent of the annual storm in Beaufort, North Carolina. Within the viewer, you can click forward, which we'll do now, and you can look at the change in extent of flooding caused by the annual storm it's blocked out here, but that should be 0.8 feet of sea level rise. Next slide, 1.6 feet of sea level rise, and both of these are in the realm of what we're expecting by 2050, according to the projections from the 2022 report. And then closer to what we expect for 2100, this is the flood extent in Beaufort for the annual storm at a sea level that's 3.3 feet higher than today. So next slide, this viewer and tool are available online, and you can pull up other locations in North Carolina and step through the different scenarios. They also provide other metrics like projections for shoreline change and the number of people impacted, and as well as economic impacts. Next slide. So as higher background water levels bring storm water levels to higher elevations, this also shifts the zone of wave impact landward. This means that we can expect increases in beach and dune erosion and more impacts to homes and roads as we go forward in time. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Of course, we're all familiar with images and firsthand experiences of the types of damage that occur during storms. And when we're thinking about mitigation and adaptation, we need to remember that the same storm of today will be much more impactful in 10 years, 20 years, and especially 40 and 50 years from now, because it will be taking place on a higher water level. Next slide. We can also expect to see increases in background long-term shoreline erosion rates. Shoreline erosion occurs when more sand, as indicated by the large arrow at the bottom, leaves a section of coast than comes in, as indicated by the smaller arrow on the top. It's just like our bank accounts. If you take more out than you put in, you're going to lose something. At least that's how I explain it to my students. As sea level rises, the rate of sand that's lost due to the rise will increase. And this leads to faster shoreline erosion rates that are background erosion rates, in addition to what we experience during storms. The image on the right is a good illustration of the landward shift in boundaries that occurs over time. Here, the dune line is now landward of what was a row of homes that at times in the past were behind the dune. Next slide. Another effect we need to keep in mind is that as sea level rises, the groundwater table also rises. So where the land surface is low, the water table will start to be higher and higher than the level of the land, resulting in inland flooding. Next slide. This leads to the backing up of storm drains and ponding of water on roads and sometimes into homes. And in combination with high tide flooding and precipitation, this can also lead to the failure of septic systems. This occurs as the amount of unsaturated soil underneath the septic system becomes limited, or the septic system becomes exposed, leading to loss of function and also to pollution. Next slide. Also related to water in the subsurface, as sea level rises, we also see a landward shift in the boundary between salty groundwater on the ocean side and fresh groundwater on the landward side. And this shift is exacerbated by the pumping of coastal aquifers, which also serves to pull that boundary between salty groundwater and fresh groundwater landward. Next slide. This is just showing the shift. Next slide. The scene of a ghost forest probably looks familiar to most of you. This is a very visible sign of saltwater intrusion. And again, simply that landward and upward shift in that boundary between salty and fresh groundwater. Forests require access to fresh groundwater, and as the groundwater becomes saltier, the forest trees die and marsh grasses that are adapted to living in salty conditions come in to take their place. Saltwater intrusion also is affecting agriculture as salty groundwater leads to soils becoming salty. This can prevent crops from growing and reduces the productivity of lands, working lands in North Carolina and elsewhere. Next slide. So in summary, I'll just remind us that distinguishing between what global sea level is doing and local sea level is doing is really important. We have a very large swath of inherently low-lying landscape in North Carolina. And we need to remember that sea level has been much lower and much higher in the past, and that boundary that we see that we know changes some over time actually can change a lot. Observations and modeling are now consistent in showing and projecting at least 1 foot of sea level rise, maybe as much as almost 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. Next slide. In North Carolina, we're seeing that rise occur faster in the north relative to the south, and impacts are already being felt and will worsen, become more challenging over time, including increases in high tide flooding, increases in storm impacts, rising water table, and saltwater intrusion. And I want to say that clearly, although there are many big challenges before us, the good news is that the sea level rise projections are becoming clearer and clearer, giving us a better understanding of what to work toward and allowing us to have the information that we need to make the most of opportunities to undertake and consider measures that will allow us to mitigate and adapt to the changes that are already starting to occur and that will continue to occur in the future. So I want to say thank you to the others who will be joining me here to shed more light on this, and thank you, Commissioners. Chair Cahoon.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
As we transition over to Dr. Sweet, I'd like to thank also Josh Kostrinsky, who's our DEQ's Deputy Director for Communications, who's our IT pilot for today, doing a great job, Josh.
Hi, this is William Sweet. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right, let me share my screen with you. Great. Can you see my presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present to you on the U.S. Interagency Sea Level Rise Task Force 2022 report. And I will focus on North Carolina. Quick bit about myself. I grew up in North Carolina, grew up in Raleigh, went to both NC State and Chapel Hill, so I understand the complexities of the state quite well. Let's start with that. And I've been with NOAA now for a bulk of my career, and proud to help advance the sciences around sea level and support the products and services that we deliver, ideally for use for state planning and so forth, as our discussion here today. Okay, sea level rise. It's real, it's happening. We measure it well from many sources. So a quick snapshot, that would be global sea level on your left since the advent of satellite altimetry. On the right would show spatially how seas are rising. And it's not rising like it would in a bathtub. There are areas you can see on the East Coast and Gulf Coast of the United States where the ocean component is rising at 4, 5, 6 millimeters per year. That's 25 millimeters in an inch or so. So we're talking an inch every 5, 6 years or so from just the ocean component in the last 3 decades. And we know why it's happening. We know it's basically, if it was a recipe, it'd be 2 parts ocean mass, meaning the melt of glaciers and ice sheets from Antarctica and Greenland and mountain glaciers, and one part thermal expansion or steric height. Ocean water warms, it takes more volume. So sort of zooming in to the next level, let's look at the United States sea level, CONUS, the contiguous United States here. What we show is based upon about 150 some tide gauges that when we do spatially weighted averages, we see that sea levels, relative sea levels, which now would include some vertical land motion where it's present, have increased about a foot in 100 years. So from about 1920 to 2020, about a foot. We know the rate has been increasing in the last 50 some years at noticeable acceleration at both the global and national, and we'll take it down to regional and local here in a moment. And so that's sort of the question is, where are we headed? It's rising, and it's rising faster. And what does the outlook for areas like North Carolina? What is that, whether it's 20 or 30 years from now or at the end of the century? So we've been writing reports every 4 years or so. The Interagency Sea Level Rise Task Force is composed of federal agencies, NOAA, NASA, USGS, DOD, quite a few of the agencies, and some academic partners who have contributed. So it really is a collective understanding of what sea level is doing and where we think it's headed based upon the latest science. So the three main questions we attempted to answer in this latest report. One is, how much sea level should we expect maybe in the next 30 years? Let's really sort of define this with a little bit more clarity and consensus, and talk about certainty and less about uncertainty. That makes people confused. But let's establish some goalposts by the end of the century, or even beyond. How much could sea levels rise? It is conditional upon future missions and the resultant of ocean atmospheric warming. That we don't have a crystal ball, but we can start developing scenarios of various warming amounts and what the responses would be, which we consider plausible. We want to narrow these goalposts as best we can, but for now we have them set as they are. And lastly, what does that actually mean? An increase in mean sea level. What does it mean in terms of a risk of flooding, or the probability of flooding reaching elevations, let's say here relative to high tide, or the zero, let's say on NOAA Sea Level Rise viewer, of about a 2-foot flood or a 3-foot or 4-foot. This is above high tide. That have some quantitative impacts by our National Weather Service and local emergency managers. What are those probabilities now, and how are they likely to change by 2050 with this expected amount or this trajectory of sea level rise that we're on? So we'll start quickly. I don't want to spend too much time. What is a scenario? Well, the scenarios again are the goalposts. It could be as low as 0.3 meters by the end of the century. That globally, and that's looking quite unlikely. That rate is the extension of what we thought was the current rate, maybe several years ago, of about 3 millimeters per year. That rate is picking up. That's looking increasingly unlikely. We'll talk about that. On the flip side, the high end of 2 meters global, that's a little bit over 6 feet by the end of the century. That's pretty unlikely, but it is still considered feasible. And there are certain types of decisions that need to know these, low probability, high impact outcomes, whether it's siting of nuclear power plants, you name it. There are reasons to report these values. But how do we get there? And so the assessments of these that went into this is the exact same that went into the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. There's 6 assessments. So globally, you get a lot of the best science, the data together, and we basically have reassembled that and sort of made the train come and go from the certain station. It's got to go in at 1 meter and out at 1 meter, 2100, and 1.5 meters and so forth. So how do we actually arrive at these targets? And the size of the bubble and the color of the bubble will kind of tell you a little bit of what it is. So to reach these low values, the largest contributors, meaning the most heavily weighted, the most likely pathway to obtain these low amounts of sea level rise, are low emissions and low warming. On the flip side, how do we get to 2 meters by 2100? Well, the very large contribution from, well, you're going to need high emissions, high warming, 4 or 5 degrees C by the end of the century. We're sort of on about a 2.5 to 3 degree Celsius warming above pre-industrial, which means late 1800s by the end of the century. That's sort of the pathway we're on for temperature. But you would need contributions from rapid ice sheet loss. Some known unknowns in the modeling that you hear about the Doomsday Glacier if it becomes unhinged. There are reasons to believe that sea levels could ramp up in rather quick timeframes, meaning multiple decades, due to processes that aren't very well modeled because we don't have that much data about them. But we do know rapid ice sheet is possible. And so those are the scenarios. And we sort of discretize them by half meters, and there are storylines that will crosswalk to each one of those as it pertains to perhaps one or two that we might highlight. So in short, emissions matter. Less emissions equals less heating, equals less ocean atmospheric heating, less melt, and you have a better chance of reaching these lower sea level scenarios. Here's what they actually look like. Again, for contiguous US, you had the low and then the high out to 2150. And so the real takeaway here is there's not that much divergence by 2050. In the next 30 years, you don't diverge much, maybe 20 centimeters or so, perhaps 30 at the most, but 15 to 20 centimeters, that's about a half foot from high to low. So we're sort of on a trajectory. There's a momentum sort of in the system. But beyond that, the wild card are the ice sheets of how much contribution will we receive from them. Okay, again, so taking it down to a smaller scale here, contiguous United States. Well, what we see is, let's look at sets of, again, the tide gauges that have variability that we can understand and quantify, remove them, spatially weight, that last 50 years, the same plot I showed before, what is the rise trajectory? And let's extrapolate or extend that out 30 years. That's the green, the black being the tide gauge. The rainbow of colors or these uncertainties around those scenarios. But really what the takeaway is we're expecting on average across the United States, which pretty much follows the mid-Atlantic region, about a foot in the next 30 years, from 2020 to 2050, about a foot. And that would match about what we had seen over the last 100. And again, 2 lines of evidence. We have modeled scenarios and we have observational evidence that share some data, but more or less are mostly independent. And so we have 2 lines of evidence sort of lining up relatively squarely with each other. Gives us greater confidence that they are aligned, they're calibrated well, and we can really get a sense of, at least over the next 30 years, we're on a course right now, and we need to communicate that. Okay, so what does it look like? Let's just take a snapshot at 2050. It doesn't really matter. We can highlight any one of the scenarios, and you're going to have similar geographic differences. The magnitudes would be a little bit different depending on the scenario. But in general, we see higher sea levels on the East Coast and Gulf Coast than the West Coast. And that has to do a lot with ocean dynamics. It's warmer water, and we have greater Gulf Stream and loop currents and things that can slow down and cause issues. But we also have vertical land motion, subsidence, which most of the East and Gulf Coast is subsiding. Let's say in North Carolina, you have still adjustment from last ice age, and you also have fresh water withdrawal. And there is a north-south sort of gradient in that. The Gulf Coast, you have compaction of sediments, but again, you have withdrawal of fresh water and fossil fuels, so some unnatural regions. But that really factors into these projections. So certain areas, it's quite significant, such as the northern parts of North Carolina. Where ice melts matters too, and there's a gravitational effect that we factor this in, recognizing that community planning happens at a more local level, and we need to take the scenarios and the projections down to a local level. So the same kind of snapshot that we just showed for the CONUS, or for the continental United States, we'll do by region now. So we have these regional sets of tide gauges that have been spatially averaged and variability removed, so we get sort of a cleaner signal, and we fit with tide gauge and extrapolate out, and we can sort of focus the northeast and southeast. That's North Carolina sort of sits in between this geographic divide. But in both instances, you can kind of get a sense that it's about a foot or so. Southeast, northeast, it's somewhere 25 to 35 centimeters. And this would be relative to 2020. I've normalized this relative to now-ish, 2020. And so you can kind of get a sense of where does this fall relative to the scenarios? What trajectory are we on, and how is that aligned with the scenarios? And we'll zoom in a little bit more about that. But relatively high rates, sort of meeting the national average, whereas let's say the West Coast is less, right? So the military would want to know this, right? You're expecting a lot more sea level than Norfolk than you are in Seattle. And that might be something to consider when we talk about, major naval installations and their longevity. NASA, who's hosting some of this data, as well as NOAA, you can go to the site, you can click and get a lot of data, but they do then, we are starting to look at no longer force fitting with linear trends. If it's not linear, let's look at the last 50 years and look at, how has the rise trajectory been occurring. And there is some decadal variability that could be leaking into this. It's still sort of science in progress, but you can really get a sense that, the rates are picking up over the last 50 years. There's definitely some nonlinearity occurring. And if you project that out, you can get sort of a rough sense of where you could be heading. We're not going to use these numbers exactly. Let's say Wilmington, we're going to use a number that's a little bit less, more along the lines of the intermediate scenario. We'll highlight some values in the results in terms of flood frequencies. So let's do that. Let's contextualize, and then we'll bring it back down to some locations and look at that data sets. But how do we contextualize the impacts of sea level rise? We started this about a decade ago. We started calling it nuisance flooding, and then that sort of became a nuisance to people. So we called it high tide flooding. I think Virginia called it recurrent flooding. Florida said, you can't say sea level rise, but you can say nuisance flooding. So I didn't really care. I just wanted people to understand and know what to look for and give it a name so that at least people can talk about it. It's an increased frequency of this minor flooding is the most obvious consequence. But how do we define what flooding was to begin with? And so we use the National Weather Service empirically calibrated thresholds with local emergency managers. So these are the same things that guide when you hear on the radio saying, a coastal flood watch or warning is in effect for the following counties. Tide levels will be X and X, these types of damages. Careful. The major, the moderate, major, or more storm surge driven, there's probably a storm. Whereas the minor now is starting to occur more often with sunny day flooding conditions, right? There's no storm, doesn't make sense, we're flooding. Well, that's decades of sea level rise catching up to you. And those are sort of the heights above average high tide, not NAPD 88. We can get into those nitty gritty, but more or less minor is about 1.5 to 2 or 1 3/4 to 2 feet above average high tide, and moderate and major, so forth. So about a foot separating these flood regimes. So we have a tool at NOAA, the Inundation Dashboard. It allows you kind of zoom in and look and say, hey, am I in flood stage? Kind of like they do for the rivers in the interior. NOAA has a site, but you can get a sense. I've lived for a long time in Annapolis, Maryland. I moved there from North Carolina when I started working for NOAA, DC, and then to Annapolis. And so, I use this for low water. I got to loosen the lines of your boat. They start sounding like banjo strings. But high water, then you get flooding that starts coming in. And so that's the exact day that we are predicting higher waters, and that was the community I live in. Your finger piers, your dock goes underwater too many times. You start to jeopardize the integrity of it. You got to replace electrical and water. It's a cost for a community. Fire pit jeopardized. These are luxury items, really, right? But downtown Annapolis, I think one of your esteemed colleagues from Dr. Hino from UNC did a study. Yep, people don't want to go shopping. Water gets up to the storefronts, and believe it or not, they don't want to go through water to shop. So it's an economic burden on communities, and the impacts are starting to surface and show themselves in various ways. And the Naval Academy has water in the streets too, I could say. So, let's take a moment and look at some locations in North Carolina and do sort of the same thing. Let's match some pictures to tide levels and look at geographic extent that's potentially in harm's way. So I had a few elevations that Laura had shared, and I tried to crosswalk as best I can. There was this area in Pea Island Visitor Center, the height of the road in mean high water, MHHW, about 2.5 to 2 3/4 foot above mean high tide. That's close to what we call this moderate high tide level. But you can see, let's say on this day where water levels in green sort of get halfway between. So I go and I grab images, right? I Google search or talk to the reporters if I know them. And so this would be what water looked like down in Avon. So water in the street, pretty significant amount of water in the street for that matter. So that's at that tide level. And so when we look, let's say the duck tide gauge, that minor threshold, not the moderate, but the minor, when does really the flooding start to become apparent? We're keeping track of those number of days per year through time. So you can see when that tide gauge came online sort of in the late 70s or so, it's growing in leaps and bounds. It's accelerating because sea level is rising. This threshold effect, I'll show a schematic in a minute. The number of events per year is increasing at a nonlinear rate, meaning it's accelerating. The impacts are accelerating. And so this is a zoom out of land at or below this about 1.75 to 2 feet or so below mean high tide. A lot of this is marsh. A lot of this doesn't have footprints, but there are a lot of roads and there are houses and there are things in the way here. And you can zoom in to an extent that the sea level rise viewer allows you to zoom in and kind of get a sense of like, oh, what's potentially exposed at these heights. So here's the Oregon Inlet tide gauge. Pretty similar threshold. It's tide range dependent, but you can same sort of general pattern. What used to require a big storm isn't really requiring a big storm any longer. There's a garden variety of reasons why you're flooding. Change of prevailing winds, a full moon tide, slow down to the Gulf Stream. All right, so let's look at another. Let's go to the central North Carolina down to Beaufort. So here would be another one of sort of a snapshot of these minor, the red, moderate be yellow. So that I was given sort of a peak road elevation in Beaufort of about a little less than a meter, so about 3 feet. That'd be NAVDA, mean high water, about 2.62. So again, close to that moderate high tide flood level. So a bit higher than the minor, but the moderate. And so what does that look like? So I just sort of grabbed an image. This isn't moderate. This would be when the tide gauge reached about 2.23 feet. So somewhere in between. And that's pretty significant. You all know the area better than I did. I used to go out to sea on the RV Cape Hatteras and the Duke Marine Lab and NC State. So we'd come down to this area, but I know I'm not used to seeing this. And I think this is happening a little bit more often than it used to the extent that when we look at the tide gauge record, similarly at Beaufort, again, this would be the minor flooding. So not quite as deep, maybe a half foot shallower than that picture there. But again, growing in leaps and bounds. What used to be really only a storm generated flood decades ago is now happening lots of times. So this is updated through the calendar year 2023. All right, let's head further south. Let's go down to Wilmington. Same sort of thing. I didn't really have a particular elevation to assess. At 10 grid, we had talked about some of the area right there on the waterfront, but we'll just let the picture and the exposure maps do the talking. So we'll pick again an instance where water levels were somewhere between the moderate and minor high tide flood threshold. And Water Street, as I'm getting acquainted to, and all the pictures that I start to Google and see, really lives up to its name. I used to come down here a lot. My sister lived in the Carolina Apartments, not too far from here. And I remember loving coming down here, but this wasn't the normal scene, but it is becoming, a bit more normal. Now I say a bit more because it's a little different in Wilmington. So this threshold, you can see the elevations aren't being exceeded as often. Again, we've sort of changed this threshold. The Weather Service used one that's lower, and I'll show this in a minute. Used one that was a little bit more normalized to what we thought folks were actually seeing. Not so much concerned about water in the parking lot and the North Carolina battleship, but a bit more widespread. And so this would be a little bit more widespread. So still general pattern, but not quite as many as exceedances. And the reason for that is the amount of variability that we tend to get in an area, let's say Wilmington, a little bit more sheltered than somewhere like Beaufort, a little bit more exposed down the coast. But let's say you did pick that 1 foot threshold with those other two thresholds shown. On the x-axis is height above average high tide. So 0.3 meters is a foot. And the left axis probability, I'm not going to worry about you. It's just worry about explaining that. It's sort of the bell-shaped curve, 365 days under that curve. And so you can see that 1 foot threshold starting to get under the fat of that curve. And so if we do the same sort of thing using a 1 foot threshold, well, that same pattern comes out. And we have a tool on our website that allows you to put in whatever threshold you want and look historically how often it's happened. And so that the top would be by year. So you can really see it starts to ramp up, just like those other thresholds. But we haven't quite flooded as much as some of these other areas, at least at those low-lying areas. Okay. The remainder of the talk is focused on, out about 30 years or so and what to expect or what to look for on the heading that we are on. So first of all, again, let's recap. We just showed some pictures, North Carolina here. Let's look at Norfolk. What does sea level rise actually look like? It's these sunny day instances of just water where the community wishes the water just wasn't doing what it's doing. It's in the streets. And there's not a storm. There might be a storm that the little girl there has an umbrella. So maybe there's some rain. But again, the rain doesn't have anywhere to go because the water is already in the streets and over the banks. And that would be Charleston. And that'd be sort of South Florida. So it's a problem. So let's think, what is it about 30 years from now? What's that problem going to potentially look like? And I say potentially means if we don't do anything with the thresholds that we have now, the footprint of the coast as we now have it. Let's just talk about flooding. Wastewater, stormwater, these other things will be another discussion. So when we look again, this is a numerical form of what those graphs showed of what trajectory are you on. So the Northeast, we had the low, intermediate, high, and high. And those were the target amounts in meters relative to year 2000. And the trajectory is highlighted in red. So about 40 centimeters regionally in the Northeast. Southeast, it's a little bit higher, sort of landing it's about 40 centimeters, but it's landing between the intermediate and intermediate high scenarios. So again, about the same amount, but the scenarios are just shifted some due to different dynamics and contributions in these areas. So, but about 40 centimeters or so relative to 2000, from 2000 to 2020, we had about 10 centimeters or so of rise. So we're talking about a foot between 2020 and 2050, 30 centimeters or 0.3 meters, 30 centimeters a foot. I know I'm going between units, so bear with me. So the way we kind of do this, and similarly sort of what I just showed with the number of how flooding will change through time, is you usually kind of come up with an engineering curve. So on the bottom, they call these return curves. So the Army Corps, we really are trying to get away with return periods. Like that's a 100-year event, right? Because then people think it really only comes every 100 years, And if you've ever been up to the polar regions, I used to go out to sea with a colleague, and he was like, the thing about polar bears are they say only 1 in 100 will eat you. You're like, okay, that makes you feel better. And he said, problem is they never seem to come in that order, right? So we want to get away from calling these things 100-year events. It's 1% annual chance. So that's on the bottom on the x-axis. So 1 would be an annual event. 0.1 would be, 10 events per year 0.1 would be every 10 years or the 10-year event. The 0.01 at the far right would be the 100-year event, right? Sometimes it's easier. But you develop these curves on variability. So you take away the trend in sea level and you say, how often do we typically hit this height and how often is that curve? They do it for stream bankful and stream design, the same thing with rivers, what is the 100-year flood and use this to guide your stream design and so forth. And what happens with sea level rise is it adjusts this curve upwards. So what's showing here is a schematic of that orange dotted line, which would be a moderate flood. In 1992, this ELW, extreme water level, would say, all right, I come down to the x-axis and say, oh, that's about every 5, 6, 7 years. But with sea level rise, the 2050 curve intersects it down here at about 5 events per year. So what that's saying is if your storms and your tides stay the same and sea level changes, your frequency of these water levels that are causing issues is going to increase. So applying that kind of methodology, which is pretty standard when we talk about sea level rise, let's apply it and look at what we are expecting then. So if we look at Duck, North Carolina, and so the top is the annual mean sea level, and that's how it's rising, and that's shaded in red would be what between the intermediate low and the intermediate scenarios would suggest. The trajectory, that's pretty close to what the trajectory for that region is. It's a little bit low right now, but again, these are annual sea levels and decadal projections. So that, to get a 2020 value, you'd really need, and they're really multi-decadal, they're really 20-year averages. You'd need a lot of data to collapse onto that. That's what the Army Corps Sea Level Tracker tool does, is we're providing a trajectory. We want to kind of characterize what's going outwards. But anyways, this would be not trajectory. These would be those two scenarios. Now, if we pick those two scenarios and then apply them to the high tide flood days, this is sort of what you see shaded in red. So your decadal average. So water level sort of hitting that 1.75 feet above average high tide really starts to take off. Again, about 180 days or so. I think my thing got shifted. It should be about half the number of days per year as your new high tide. So high tide would be once you get to about 180 days per year. And so that's what it's telling us. So a little bit about these scenarios. The intermediate scenario at 2050, we kind of know this trajectory. You're probably close to the intermediate, if not a little bit higher in some of these locations. Oh, excuse me, that's telling me to hurry up. But if we get out to the end of the century, about a 3-degree pathway, we're getting pretty close to the intermediate scenario. So the intermediate is pretty robust, I think, in terms of 2050 and 2100. So that'd be the upper part of the red shaded band. So here, if you zoom in, this would be the land exposed at the high tide flood, about 1.75 feet. Again, a lot of this is going to be kind of people may not be living on all this land, but there is definitely roadways and there's definitely some property definitely exposed. So the same thing, I won't belabor it quite as much detail, same sort of thing for Beaufort. Here's its annual mean sea level on the top. Here's that intermediate low to intermediate scenarios. Again, sort of that 1 foot by 2050. I don't know if you can see my cursor somewhere in here compared to where we were in 2020, 15 centimeters, 45 centimeters. It's a foot. Here's how your high tide flood days would then increase. And again, this is this distribution as it crosses that threshold. Eventually you saturate, meaning 365 days per year, water's above that threshold. Here's again is land at or below, susceptible to this type of flooding. And lastly, we'll go down the same thing for Wilmington. So here's Wilmington sea level. Here's its range between those two scenarios, decadal ranges, and the same sort of thing with the high tide flooding days in response. Here's land at or below these elevations. My last slide really is sort of like, well, let's take it a little bit deeper. Okay, let's do that moderate flooding. Those pictures we showed where now we're not talking minor, we're talking about moderate. This is a significant issue with property. People are ripping out floorboards. This happens in Annapolis, and they have little small grants coming out to get businesses back on their feet to help them, $80,000, $100,000 grants to, this store that had issues and getting them up and back. So what I'm showing here is at our tide gauges where we have minor, moderate, major on the left is currently in 2020. That's its frequency. I know it's a little granular, hard to see. Orange means about 1 to 5. Orange to red means it's happening more than once a year. Okay. If it's sort of bluish, it's happening less than once a year. Dark blue is happening much less. The probabilities are much less. But what we see by 2050, when we sort of take the trajectory that these areas are on, what we see is the moderate flood starts to happen on average, and this is a whole U.S. average, starts happening about, the moderate flooding takes on the frequencies of minor, and that makes sense. With about a foot of sea level rise, there's only a foot separating these flood regimes, we have a regime shift. So what now used to be moderate will become major flooding and so forth. And so when we look at an area, let's say Norfolk, and we do the same thing, a moderate flood, which would be the orange and red, this is making the Navy raise their road to get into the naval base because it's more than 8 inches of water on the crown of the road, and that's relatively considered impassable. So 1990, that was about a 20% annual chance. Every 5 years, that amount of water level that would water levels would hit that target. Now, about 1 event per year. 2050 in our headlights, 5 to 10 events per year. So, this is, it's real, it's happening. And this is Norfolk. So last slide, Front Street, you could take the sea level rise viewer and just say, well, let me go up to 3 feet and see what it might look like. And these are georeference photos. They're supposed to be relatively accurate to the land elevation and what's considered the depth of water to reach that. And you kind of get a sense of, all right, what's potentially at risk of 3 feet of water above average high tide, no matter how it gets there. Today it'd be a storm, but let's say in 2050 with a foot of sea level rise and then typical storm variability, what does this mean for a place like Front Street or these areas shaded? You know, and then up and down North Carolina. So now hitting about 3 feet above average high tide, let's say in Oregon, the Outer Banks, you know, 50% annual chance, meaning every other year. And this is not waves. This is not wave overtopping. This is not wave erosion. This is considered, you know, calmer water conditions as tide gauges would measure them. Beaufort, about 20% annual chance, or about every 5 years. Wilmington, less, about 10% annual chance or a 10-year event. By 2050 on the sort of that intermediate kind of pathway of sea level rise, then that changes to Oregon and Outer Banks, about 5 to 10 events per year. An event could be 2 days, several high tides. Beaufort, 5 to 10 events per year, and Wilmington, an event a year. So that's it. You know, I guess what this is really kind of showing again is that, you know, sea level rise is here. It's now. The impacts are already being felt. We're on a heading. We have a trajectory. Unless we change our footprint, you know, this using calibrated thresholds of the Weather Service emergency managers as an example of how these impacts are likely to change unless we change. And that collectively, we're probably not changing emissions by what North Carolina does, but what we can do is have North Carolina prepare for what's coming, right? So it's to not scared, but to help prepare for what's on the horizon and what's coming. So with that, I'll pause and conclude the talk.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Seeing none. I'm sorry, excuse me, Mr.
Yeah,
Commissioner King.
I'm curious, I think from your Mr. Sweet as well as the previous, I'm curious as to the percent, I guess the two causes for sea rise are land-based, which is primarily, I guess, melting ice, and the other is ocean, which is temperature. What percent do you attribute to this problem to land versus ocean, representing the problem that we're looking at? I suspect it's not 50-50.
No, it used to be 50-50 about 2 or 3 decades ago or closer. Now it's about 2/3 ice melt, 1/3 thermal expansion. And that would just be, and those are, you know, rounded numbers, of course. And that would just be the ocean side of things. And then the other obviously major component would be what your land is doing. So not ice on land, but is your land sinking in areas like, you know, northern North Carolina, probably 2-3 millimeters a year, 4 perhaps in certain areas. And so that would then contribute to relative sea level rise.
Thank you.
Larry?
Go ahead.
I don't want to come across as a smart aleck, but I'm just kind of curious because you said we were measuring these things 1,000 years ago, and I'm just wondering who was measuring 1,000 years ago. I'm not going to ask you to answer that. But in a short summary, I guess we're blaming this on global warming because of our footprint, because of our carbon emissions, and this is not being hypocritical. I just got to ask this question because I don't know how long we've been studying oceanography, but exactly, was there global warming before there was carbon emissions? And has there always been carbon emissions before we had cars and electricity and stuff like that? I mean, in your belief, is it that people breathing cause carbon emissions? I mean, more population? I mean, like I said, I'm not trying to be smart. I'm just curious about, you know, where does this scientifically come from? And without any change, can it turn the other way? Is there ever a chance that the temperatures will begin to drop?
Temperatures always warmed and increased. Milankovitch cycles, 100,000, 400,000 year cycles, which then drove changes in carbon levels in the atmosphere and the ocean and global sea level rise. Those 3 things have been moving in tandem for a long time, millions and millions of years. And what triggers them typically has been the Milankovitch. It's been solar radiation, and then the others follow suit and there's feedbacks and so forth. So we can see that in the geological record, ice core records. But what has gotten out of whack has been the imbalance of where carbon sits. And so what used to be in the ground is now in the atmosphere, and it's a long life. And so we can definitely start to pick up. You asked who's measuring 1,000 years ago. Well, a lot of scientists actually along the East Coast of the United States, they look at your marsh grass depositional, and they can kind of make these cores, and they can really kind of see the rates at which the marsh grasses have been changing with sea level. It's very highly tuned proxy. And then when it overlaps with the tide gauge records, they can, around the world as well, as they can really start to place it in additional levels of evidence. And so it's the imbalance now of the carbon. If we get that carbon out of the atmosphere, because it's going to be up there for thousands of years. It doesn't wax and wane. We do have seasonal cycles. And so the way they kind of deduce, like, how's humans been contributing to it? They have counterfactual. Essentially, we collectively, the scientific community, models the factors driving changes in temperature with carbon and with these cycles. And basically, it's almost a consensus that large part, more than the majority of heating that's occurred in the last 30, 40, 50 years is definitely human related. These same models that they use to do this are the more or less the same models you use to guide your weather. You bring an umbrella outside, it's just a little faster hitting. So if you have faith in your weather models, which I get it, sometimes it rains when it's not supposed to, but it's the same types of models that we use to discern that. And so, obviously that's a whole college course in itself, everything I'm trying to tell you in about 2 minutes, but it's the imbalance now. We just got to get the carbon out of the atmosphere, because when we have carbon this high, and we can go back and look in the ice core records, right? When was the last time we had carbon dioxide over 400 parts? You look back and you're like, oh, well, we came close to that 100,000 years ago. And we had close to that again about 2 or 3 million years ago. And the Suffolk Scarp, there's areas of showing where sea levels have been during some of that. So not quite up to that high, but same amount of carbon dioxide, very similar temperatures, and sea levels have been on the order of 5 to 10 meters higher. And that may shake out over the course of a couple hundred years from now, or 1,000 years. There's called an equilibrium, a commitment. And what we're trying to put our finger on is how quickly that might occur.
And if I may, Billy explained that very well and accurately. And I would just highlight and further emphasize that it is the rate at which carbon is being taken from the places where it has been sequestered and released into the atmosphere that is leading to the very rapid warming that we're seeing now. And the rate of warming is higher than what we've tended to see in the past.
Larry?
Yes, thank you for your presentations. This is a crucial issue. These numbers we use for sea level rise rates or expectations. It's not only direct economic impacts, but it impacts every one of these communities. And it's not just buildings and roads, it's insurance, it's weather, economic forecasting. We have to get it pretty darn close. And I was looking at a lot of your materials in it, and a lot of the data is coming from NOAA. I go onto NOAA sites, and especially the tide stations, and we are talking about relative sea level rise rates. Y'all are projecting 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, or essentially 25 years. I can go to either one of these based on historical graphs, and NOAA is predicting 1.3 feet in 100 years. That's in Virginia, 1.94 at Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, 1.6 feet in Duck in 100 years. Oregon Inlet Marina, 1.82 feet in 100 years. Beaufort, 1.16. And going down to, Wilmington area, it's 0.9 feet in 100 years.
Billy, do you want to speak to this, being the one from NOAA?
Sure.
Yeah.
You're looking at the tides and currents, and that's where they force these linear fits over the entire record. That's
They are
prob-
linear fits.
Yeah, and I've been talking with my NOAA colleagues. We're going to the NASA site where we're starting to really do, we're trying to talk to the NOAA that they aren't projections. That's history. And that's history forced with the linear fit. If you look at the last, if you let the statistics do the talking and you start to look at last 40, 50, 60 years and you say, is it linear? It's not. It's quadratic when you start to allow that statistic to be there. And so that's a problem. And I've heard this sometimes on Monroe County, Florida, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, like, hey, y'all are predicting that. And it's like, no, that's not a prediction. That's a historical trend forced with the linear fit over period of record. And that period of record is the characteristic of that change is changing. And so, right, we have a communication issue going on here where it's not so much saying that's going history is going to repeat itself. Is we're using the scenarios and we're using trajectories and we're having new websites where we're trying to do a better job communicating that. So I would caution you to consider the historical linear trend fits over the historical record, to consider that a prediction, because it is not.
Well, we're talking about relative sea level rise rates, correct? And you've got to base it on data. Anything beyond today is going to be a projection.
I think I can clarify a little bit here, and just re-emphasize or, explain it in an additional way what Billy's saying, which is that you have your historical data and you can force a linear fit to that data. So you can say, we're only going to allow our statistics to give us a line. And that means what you lose is what's happening in the latter part of the record, which is where the acceleration is showing up. So you can't do a linear prediction on tide gauge data. You can't do a linear fit to tide gauge data that's historical tide gauge data and have that be a prediction for the future, because it completely ignores the latter portion of the record, which is the most critical portion of the record, because it captures the increase in rise that we are already starting to see. And that rise is consistent with the model scenarios that are, coming out of the models that are not too unlike your weather forecast models. So it's an outgrowth of the way that the data is being looked at and used. And I would just strongly emphasize what Billy said, which is that that's not a prediction when you do a linear fit.
Well,
So I would caution you from relying on that, because you're going to be missing a very important part of the picture.
I'm old enough, late 70s, and your graph, I think it was the fourth one by Fairbanks, is an excellent graph looking at geological ice age going back 20,000 years to present, as far as projection. We're on a plateau. If you look geological times, but for this type of planning, we aren't looking geological.
No, we're not.
We're looking,
We don't need to look. We don't need to think geological. That was just an illustration of how much sea level has changed in the past. And those aren't projections. That's actual data.
right, yeah, but I'm old enough to remember when science in the late 70s said we're going back into an ice age. That's what science was predicting in the late 70s. So now we got now we've got science telling us that we're going on this hockey stick rise.
Well, we also have science showing us, and I think we'll soon hear from Dr. Sino and Anardi, that we are seeing flooding in our communities more often. And if you're not convinced by the data, I can respect that. But we also can look at how wet our feet are getting and how often. And that's corroborating what we're seeing coming out of the latest science.
Sweet pointed that out. And I think, flooding is more, there's a lot of components to flooding, and land subsidence is about half of relative sea level rise. That was shown the last time we did an update on sea level rise. We finally got that recognized. That subsidence is half of.
Well, and subsidence is leading to rise.
Sure.
That we want to
No
prepare
question
for.
about it. And so we've got both those components, but both of them are combined together. It's not just all sea level rise. And but the other issues, and I agree with you, local flooding is cumulative. It's when you get areas developed, you get stormwater controls that hold water back drainage controls, those all contribute to flooding. And so it's a combination of a lot of the above on this, but it's crucial. I appreciate y'all's work, but we have to have realistic and very good numbers for projections. And when I see a 2 to 3 times rate of sea level rise from now to 2050 in 25 years, and I see same NOAA data, sitting there saying, well, that'll occur in 100 years. I have a hard time.
I can understand the
50
challenge of
and then, trying to come back and, oh, we're going to come back, make policy based on a number or range. And it'll always be a range. And that's crucial. No question about it. But I do appreciate y'all's work. It's very, very good.
Mr. Hennessy?
Yes, thank you both for the detailed presentations. And likewise, I have a hard time trying to follow the, I guess, the philosophy of not looking at historical data. When we look back at the historical data and you see some areas where there was few years there was not as much of a sea level rise as compared to other years. And I mean, looking back at one of them, I mean, it was less than 8 inches for the past century. Sea level rise. That was something I was pulling from Dr. Robert Dean. So I just, I've noticed issues come up many times before I believe when there was at one time a report that was calling for a 56-inch sea level rise back in 2010. And I like to look a little bit more into the data and compare from now to back then and see what the historical data is telling us, the trends.
Yeah, everything that Billy shared includes historical data applied in using the best, most sophisticated approaches to telling us what we would be wise to prepare for. Billy, do you have a comment? I'm not sure what your question, if there's a question in that.
It wasn't a question, it was just more of a statement.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yep.
Sorry.
DR.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Yates, just 1 second.
I appreciate what everybody is saying here. And I'm not in my late 70s yet. So I'm between Mr. Hennessy. Anyway, I'm closer to the late 70s, but I used to live in Winston-Salem. And in the 80s, a lot of people in Winston-Salem were in denial about tobacco causing lung cancer. And it was, there's a saying that if your livelihood depends on tobacco, you have a hard time seeing lung cancer. And there are a lot of us whose lives depend on water not rising for our livelihoods. And I think it does affect our view. And I just want to say thank you to both presenters for being very clear. And I will say, to me, this is the biggest issue that we can face. And I appreciate what you're saying and totally, I won't say I totally understand it, but I'm with you.
Thank
We
you.
go.
I guess I kind of want to apologize for starting the dialogue like that. I weren't trying to be questionable. And honestly, thank you so much for the presentation. I think you still got 1 or 2 more left to go, so I won't take up any more of that time. I didn't want you to think that we did not appreciate what you're bringing to us, because it does relate. And like Mr. Baldwin and Commissioner Hennessy said, does it relate now? I don't know, but and tomorrow we'll have to make decisions about what's going to hit home now. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the rules require us to look at this every 10 years. So it's good information, and we thank you so much for that.
Sure.
It's every
And I'm
5
glad to
years.
talk with you further.
All right, Mr. Andrew?
Yes, I just want to make a comment regarding, I mean, obviously, there's quite a bit of scientific data that was presented to us, a lot of charts and figures that I found very informative. And I think they should be used in what we're trying to do as far as some guidelines and procedures for the coast. But I can also tell you just from my own observations, at my pier. That pier is either underwater or almost underwater considerably more frequently than it used to be in the years I've been observing it just myself. And then in Wilmington at the battleship North Carolina, I think you could ask the captain of the battleship there, and he's been keeping records, his own records, just as a person trying to operate a tourist attraction that's parking lot is flooded more and more frequently every year. So I think there's anecdotal data that somewhat correlates this increase in nuisance flooding, whatever we want to call it, that somewhat correlates with the scientific data.
Mr. Emery?
Yeah, just having been involved in this since we first started looking at it and hearing this update, it appears to me that things have only gotten worse since the first time we looked at it. And I appreciate the unfortunate information that you have presented us today. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. There's a lot of data. And for those of us that live on the coast, we can see it more and more frequently. In Nags Head, I see it all the time, more on the sound side than I do the ocean side, but there is still more oceanfront flooding and loss of property damage. Seems Nags Head is in every picture of houses on the beach and things that, where the erosion. Tankard, next.
Sure. Next up, we have Dr. Nardi and Dr. Hino.
Good afternoon, thank you.
Such a small screen on our end. So that was a really good segue into what we'll be talking about today, which is the here and now. We're not talking about the past. We're not necessarily talking about the future. We're talking about flooding right now in North Carolina. And our big takeaway for today is that it is flooding more than we know. Next slide. So Billy and Laura already talked about this quite a bit, but coastal flooding is occurring in the absence of extreme events due to sea level rise. And that's really been popularized within the media for these big urban centers. But like Billy was saying, it's happening in North Carolina as well. Next slide. And Billy gave us a tour of the tide gauges in North Carolina. So tide gauge data are what we use as scientists to estimate flood frequency. And tide gauges are located over marine water bodies. So the schematic that we're showing here is a tide gauge that is sensing the water level in a marine water body. And this water level is so high that it's overtopped the outlet for a local stormwater network, and water unabated can go up through that stormwater network and out onto roadways. So for situations like this, where we have high water levels in a marine water body, tide gauges do a really good job at estimating flood frequency. Next slide. But Billy would tell you, folks at NOAA would tell you, tide gauges are not intended to capture all sources of flooding, in particular land-based sources of flooding. So they do not capture sources from rainfall, from high groundwater, or from faulty infrastructure, like I'm showing with this schematic right here. So with this case, we have a water level in the marine water body that is measured by the tide gauge, but it doesn't exceed the road elevation, but it does reduce the capacity in the stormwater network. So water has nowhere to go with rain, with just a little bit of rain. Next slide. So tide gauges are also sparse. Billy showed us data from each of the tide gauges in North Carolina, and I'm showing them again here. And NOAA provides estimates of flood frequency on a yearly basis. So again, the floods that are not associated with extreme events through their monthly high tide flooding outlook at each of these 4 gauges in coastal North Carolina. Next slide. So what Miyuki and I and our groups have been trying to do over the last several years is really fill in the data gaps in places between those 4 tide gauges to really figure out how often is it currently flooding on land. So not in marine water bodies, but where people live, and what are the impacts to individuals, to communities, and not just now, but potentially in the future. What is the true burden of sea level rise in terms of impacts? So these floods can be hyper local. They can just go from block to block, like I'm showing here through this GIF from one of our cameras in Carolina Beach. The floods can last just a couple minutes to several hours, and they're not just high tide floods anymore. They're tides combined with a little bit of rainfall, combined with some contributions from groundwater, combined with some stormwater networks not behaving properly. So it's really hard to know what to call these floods. So today, they're just floods from sea level rise. Next slide. So first up, how often is it flooding in North Carolina? Not from tide gauges, but from our land-based estimates. Next slide. To do this, we had to come up with a new way of sensing floods. We developed what we called 3 years ago the sunny day flood sensors, but really these sensors capture all sorts of drivers. We place these sensors in stormwater networks so they can measure water levels coming up through drains and reduce capacity in these stormwater networks. They transfer the data in real time, which can help coastal managers try to identify what's going on within the stormwater system. And they also take camera images. Everything's communicated in real time through a web app. And we're going to go through some of this data in the next couple slides. Next slide. So these sensors can capture the marine-based floods. Next slide. And also these land-based sources. Next slide. Here's what they look like. This is my PhD student, Thomas Thalen in Carolina Beach. This is one of our early sensors in a drain. And then pointing on the right in the figure, there's a small camera, and that's the camera that produced the GIF that I showed you in that other slide. So we've had these sensors deployed in 5 coastal communities. Some communities have more than one sensor since 2021 in some locations. Next slide. So the reality check for today. It is flooding on land more than our tide gauges suggest. So more than the numbers that Billy put up on the screen. For the period between April 7th, 2023, almost a year ago, to April 8th, 2024, we identified the following instances of water on the road, shown here for 3 example sensors in Beaufort, Carolina Beach in the middle, and then sea level in down East Carteret County on the right, where an instance of flooding is any amount of water on the road outside of an extreme event. And we choose any amount of water because this could be salt water and somebody can drive through it and it can impact their car or infrastructure. So in Beaufort, we observed 28 instances of water on the road, which totaled 22 days of flooding. So you can have multiple floods in one day due to the combination of different drivers. In Carolina Beach, we observed 60 days of flooding. And then in the most flood-prone region that we've been looking at in sea level, 144 instances of flooding over 124 days. That's about a third of the year that there has been water on the road outside of an extreme event. Next slide.
Okay. So I'm going to we're going to go through these communities one by one and talk through what we're seeing in each case and what we're learning from working with the communities on these flooding challenges. As you can see, we've got a range here from more urban, more developed, a more engineered stormwater network in Beaufort and Carolina Beach to more rural, Rolana ditches, and much less flood data in the case of sea level. So starting in Beaufort, where we had 22 days of flooding. Next slide. Sorry, that's gonna confuse me for sure. Starting in Beaufort, where we had 22 days of flooding. Next slide. This was work led by Adam Gold, who was a postdoc at UNC at the time and is now at the Environmental Defense Fund. Our sunny day floods in Beaufort, where there's no rainfall at all, those are captured very well by the NOAA tide gauge. So all of that data that Billy showed in this last slide, those are capturing these sunny day only tidal floods very well. This is animation from our sensor on Front Street in Beaufort, and in that storm drain, that's kind of in the top right part of your image, we've got a sensor in that storm drain. On the bottom right is a plot of the water levels we're observing, that's in blue, and the water levels from the NOAA tide gauge, that's in pink. You actually can't really tell that there are two lines because they track each other so well. So the NOAA tide gauge is doing a very good job of capturing these types of events. Next slide. However, when it rains, we see big differences between what the tide gauge is reporting and what we see in our sensors. So again, in the plot on the bottom left, the pink line is what that NOAA tide gauge is recording. The black line in this case is our data. And you can see that the black line spikes and it diverges from the tide gauge. And that's when we have rainfall. The rain is happening with stormwater networks that are impeded because the water is backing up into the storm drains. So when rain falls, it has nowhere to go and it pools up and it causes flooding. And there's a picture of that on the right. Next slide. This is data from the very beginning of our deployment in Beaufort, so June to November 2021. And what you're looking at is the cross section of Front Street. So the upper gray bars on the left are the sidewalks, and then the road is like the hump across the middle of your screen. We recorded 24 floods over this time period. So each green and pink line on that slide is the height of a different flood event. 25% of our floods were occurring on rainy days. So those are events that tide gauges aren't designed to capture. Over this same time period, so of our 24 floods, 4 of those events surpassed what is NOAA's high tide flood threshold, and 8 of them surpassed the National Weather Service's minor flood threshold. Next slide, please. Okay, next I'll move to Carolina Beach, where we recorded 68 floods over 60 days in the past year. Next slide. Here I'm showing model results from our PhD student, Thomas Thielen. What you can see here is a map of Carolina Beach, and Canal Drive is the road that kind of runs from the middle of the top all the way down along the water in the bottom left-hand corner. This model output is showing where the water would have gone if it had just been tides on this particular day, if we had just had the tidal forcing. And what you can see in the animation is in the yellow box, we have water that just kind of gets onto the road there, but it doesn't reach Canal Drive if we had just tides. Next slide. When we model actual conditions on January 22nd, 23, we add wind. And what you see with wind is now in that yellow box in the upper part of your screen, you see a lot more water, and the water reaches Canal Drive and flows all the way down to where we have that sensor marked in the bottom left. And so it was not just the tide alone, but it was the wind that really caused the water to go much farther than it would have otherwise. Next slide. And this series of pictures is showing you what it looks like when Canal Drive floods. So we get quite deep floods along this stretch of the road, and it can actually also happen quite quickly. Next slide. The town of Carolina Beach does actively prepare for and try to mitigate the impacts of these floods. For example, what I'm showing here is they put out notices on Facebook. They tell their community when they're expecting king tides, when they're expecting flooding, and they're going to need to close the roads. They use the tide predictions to identify days that they need to monitor the road and potentially go close it. But what we found in our analysis is that 30% of the floods that we observe, they occur at tides that actually are below the community monitoring threshold. And it's because there's rainfall, there's wind, there's other contributions that are making it flood on those days. So on those days, there's no town staff that's monitoring the road. it floods and they have to respond and they're not prepared for those impacts. Next slide. We are doing ongoing work with the town to try to understand the experiences of the residents and explore potential strategies for mitigating flooding moving forward. So this is a picture of a postcard that we sent to every residential address in Carolina Beach earlier this year. And we received 372 responses. Next slide, please. And one of the things we asked was about their preferences and levels of support for different adaptation strategies. On the left are the results for how much they support or oppose removing infrastructure, houses or roads from areas that frequently flood and restoring wetlands. And the bars on the left, it goes strongly oppose, neither support nor oppose, support and strongly support. And you can see for this particular strategy, there is actually a good amount of representation in all 5 categories, but more in the oppose and strongly oppose responses. On the right is the same question, but for installing stormwater pumps to move water elsewhere. And here you can see much higher levels of support. So what we're working with the town and residents, as well as our research team, is to formulate different potential flood mitigation strategies, model what they would do using the model that we've developed, and then help them prioritize and identify what they might do in the future. Next slide.
So we've talked about how often it's flooding in coastal North Carolina, but what are the impacts? Billy mentioned business revenues, this central bullet, and some of Miyuki's work in Annapolis, Maryland, where less customers will go to businesses if there's water in the road, which leads to lower revenues. We also know that there have been traffic delays. So along the U.S. East Coast, there has been work that has shown that there has been over 100 million vehicle hours of traffic delays. And into the future, this is expected to get worse. But what about water quality? This GIF on the right shows for the flood in Carolina Beach that there was a trash can that gets knocked over and the trash floats away. So there's been very limited work on water quality, and most of it has been focused on the receiving water body. Next slide. So we've been working at NC State to try to understand the water quality impacts that may be associated with these floods. So for example, this schematic that I'm showing here illustrates that some of our sewer pipes are now underwater because they were constructed decades ago. And what we've found first in Beaufort and now in Carolina Beach is that tidal floodwaters can have poor water quality and they may present health risks. Next slide. I'm only going to focus today on the work in Carolina Beach. This was done by Natalie Nelson and her PhD student, Megan Carr. Last summer, we went out and we sampled at key intersections that typically flood. Those are shown by the red circles. We also sampled in the receiving water body. Those are the blue circles. And we sampled for this marine fecal indicator bacteria called Enterococcus. Next slide. So importantly, floodwaters are not regulated, but concentrations in Carolina Beach last summer greatly exceeded the REC standards. What I'm showing here with each of these bar charts is the concentration of Enterococci and the most probable number per 100 milliliters. Note that this is a log scale. The threshold for recreational water quality is that red line. It's 100. And these are all of the intersections that we sampled at with those red dots for just 3 floods. And at almost every intersection for every flood, there was Enterococci that was above REC standards almost 10 to 100 times. So next slide. Just because there's poor water quality doesn't necessarily mean it's a human health risk. This is an area of ongoing study, and we're working with the health department, doing more sophisticated analysis to try to understand if this presents itself in gastrointestinal issues. But it's important to exercise caution that these floods may present a health risk. I've seen children playing in these floods in Carolina Beach, like it was bay water. So we've produced this fact sheet through North Carolina Sea Grant, and we are trying to disseminate it through local health departments. So exercise caution when entering these floods. Next slide. So last but not least, the most flood-prone part of the state, Carteret County, down east Carteret County, at least from the communities that we're working with. So just as a reminder, we saw 144 instances of water on the road over 124 days. And note that sea level is not too far from Beaufort. So they're both in Carteret County. Beaufort, what Miyuki showed you with our data, is right next to a tide gauge. So the tide gauge did a really good job at that location in measuring flooding, and not as good of a job pretty close by in sea level. Next slide. So this is down east Carteret County. On the lower left, that green dot is Beaufort. On the upper right, that gray dot is Cedar Island, and sea level is right below it. So this is a pretty small geographic area, but like I said, it's the patterns of flooding really differ, and that's in part because of the sounds. We have wind contributions that differ in down east, as you guys know, in down east, than you get in Beaufort. Rain differs. You have all of these tidal creeks. So in thinking about what are the impacts in Beaufort versus down east, both now and into the future, our colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, Elizabeth Frankenberg, has been performing surveys within communities across Carteret County for the past several years. Next slide. To try to understand the different impacts. So what I'm showing here, it looks like the text is pretty big. The share of respondents, the percent of people that responded to the survey is on the y-axis. And these are the different impacts, the disruptions to daily life that we asked about. So first, about 40% of respondents indicate that their property floods outside of hurricanes. About 20% of those respondents say that these floods disrupt their ability for their children to get to school. About 40% say that these floods disrupt their ability to get to work. Again, about 40, these floods disrupt errands. And about 30, they disrupt social activities. So the fact is, these floods are happening now across North Carolina at a frequency higher than our tide gauges suggest, and they're impacting daily life. Next slide. So those are our key takeaways. Coastal residents are already feeling the burden of flooding from sea level rise. We need measurements of floods on land to truly understand how frequently they're happening and what ingredients are causing flooding, even across really small geographies like down east to Beaufort. It's flooding on land more than our tide gauges suggest, and that's due in large part to wind and rain. And we've known about wind tide for a long time in North Carolina. This is nothing new to the people that live in these areas, but now we're just getting data to supplement what we already know from NOAA, that these tides are happening, or these floods are happening and they're impacting people. With that, next slide. All of our data are publicly available to all of you in real time online, and you can download them for your region. And those are the links for individual communities. So with that, we'll take any questions.
Thank you very much. Highly informative presentation. The chart that showed the bacterial counts at the intersections, and then again, I guess at the water level, was that estuarine water or ocean water?
That's estuarine water.
Estuarine water.
Yep.
Okay.
Coming up through stormwater networks or overtopping shorelines.
Do you have any way of gauging the bacteria that's going into the ocean waters?
So we are trying to look at that now. We're trying to track the floodwater as it recedes from the roadway and understand the residence time of that contaminated floodwater within basins and whether or not it gets to the ocean side. So as soon as it gets into the receiving basin, it becomes a recreational water quality issue.
Right.
So that's something that we can act on, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Shuttleworth?
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation. As a resident of Carolina Beach who lives just a couple of blocks from your photograph, I'm pretty familiar with it. And having served on council for 10 years there and dealing with the stormwater issue along Canal, the one slide that you have that showed the north end where the water came in and caused the wind, we have 7 lots on Canal that have no bulkhead. That is one. That particular lot, we have been working with CAMA and other agencies for 10 years to try and figure out how to do a bulkhead there. A bulkhead alone on that lot would prevent an awful lot of that flooding that you saw. The other problem that I have watched and experienced is the development and stormwater retention. So an awful lot of our non-storm flooding, nuisance flooding, sunshine flooding, is related to the fact that when the harbor tide comes up, our stormwater outfalls are dramatically submerged and there's no head pressure that's going to push into the harbor. So as more development occurs, we need to come up with better stormwater plans, and that would alleviate some of the flooding. I don't disagree with a lot of the other scientific facts that you presented. We don't let our kids play in the stormwater, and most residents try not to let them kayak during the floods either, but we see a lot of that. But I do think we have a stormwater outfall problem. It is as big as anything when our stormwater outfall is 4 feet below the harbor. It's awful hard to push the rainwater into the harbor when the tide's up. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Are we allowed to respond, Nicole?
Yes,
Okay.
you are.
Thank you for sharing that. We did, with that same model that I showed you, we actually modeled what would happen if we raise all of the bulkheads to an equal elevation across Carolina Beach. And you're 100% right. It does stop the water from the sound coming in. But something interesting, when we do increase sea levels for future scenarios, water found a way, and where it found a way was up north of Florida Ave. It actually comes over the marshes and down Canal Drive. So it's,
Well aware of it. Yep.
yeah, it's a really an interesting problem. And I think that what we're trying to do is work with the community and think about some of the solutions and how they may play out in the next decade with some of Billy's.
And that's my comment to the commissioners was also that stormwater and how communities, urban communities that interface with the coast deal with their stormwater, because the more you develop, you create the stormwater that used to infiltrate and it has no place to go. So we're pushing it into the harbor and it can't get there when the tide's up. So we've got to come up with some other solutions. So.
Mr. Baldwin?
I know it's after 5, but I appreciate this component of perception of flooding, you know, trying to differentiate from sea level rise versus coastal flooding from inland sources or rainfall. And that's a very crucial differentiation. This is very good information to add into what we have. It's in the building of infrastructure, especially on the coast, it's crucial that we think ahead. Right now, for instance, DOT in most road building avoids wetlands today. But the roads are being built perpendicular to the wetlands where the waters are coming to the coast. And if they are not built right and not engineered right, they become just what you're showing. They become levees, they become dams, and they hold water back. Hold water back, flood on the up gradient side, and then who is ever on the down gradient side gets all that water to wherever the culverts and outlets are. And last thing is, it's interesting, and it may be a interesting expansion. You might be able to get more money for it. But we had to do a quick little study, especially Norfolk area, on flooding. And it's an interesting thing because they have the same thing like rainy day, sunny day flooding. And if you take the graphics of those areas where they're flooding and go back to the 1800s maps and overlay, you'll see the same areas that are flooding today are filled wetland areas. The water still wants to go. The way the land was formed, the way the drainage occurs, it's still going in the same direction. It's either filled or either there's obstructions blocking the water up, which is a key ingredient to try to get any kind of handle on this. But that was a great presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Hennessy?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I thought it was very enlightening too. Couple questions. So, couple comments that have been made is about the infrastructure. Are y'all working on some recommendations and a plan to try to make some suggestions to what you see might work in Carteret County to infrastructure? And to that point, are you working with DOT and some of their division engineers on what is actually something that can be put to good use in some of these areas, such as what Mr. Shuttleworth was talking about?
So most of our research, it's research, it's not design. And with DOT, they have to perform feasibility studies, whether or not there is actually enough material for, let's say, like in Down East to raise the roads. For example, from like Cedar Island to sea level. So it's something that that's not our expertise, is design, but we can model scenarios within our models and compare it to data. So that's what we're doing, is modeling hypothetical retrofits, but not necessarily whether they're feasible from a design standpoint. So that's a little bit of playing with words there. I understand that. So we include key individuals from DOT, from local planning organizations within our workshops, but really the ideas are driven by the community to facilitate discussions about the future. But to do design, that would require a consultant or other DOT staff.
You had a follow-up.
Anybody else first, then I'll come back to you. Mr. King?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My observation doesn't require an answer necessarily, but I found like everybody else, I guess, the presentations are informative and instructive. So thank you for that very much. But my question goes to why do you call destructive and damaging tides king tides? Why not czar, majestic, even queen tides? Why king tides?
It's the highest.
I did not come up with that name, but I strongly support queen tide.
Mr. Hennessy?
I think another one is nuisance flooding, but you had mentioned that Carteret County was more prone for flooding than your other areas. What would you attribute to that? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the tides in that area? I mean, we have a 2-foot tide relatively up here, but you go down to Holden Beach and you got a 5-foot tide at high tide. So, I mean, the tides are different in all up and down the coast.
Do you want me to take?
Yeah, go ahead.
So number one, sea level Davis, it's very low. Number two, different stormwater infrastructure. There are ditches within most of Down East. Ask anyone in Down East, those ditches are full because marsh is migrating upwards with sea level rise. The groundwater table is higher, so those ditches are full of water. Once they're clear, there's nowhere for water to go. So the number one factor, I think, is the difference in elevation, but then you have different exposure to wind and the pushing up of water by the wind in Down East than Beaufort. Same thing with the rainfall. Because it's so low lying and the groundwater is so high, there's no infiltration. The water from the rain has nowhere to go. It stays on the road. So it's all the same ingredients. It's rain, it's groundwater, it's wind, it's tides, it's sea level rise, but it's all those other land-based factors and infrastructure factors that are leading to the differences between Down East and Beaufort.
And I'll add that our coverage right now is Carteret County, New Bern, Carolina Beach, there's a lot of the state that we don't cover at the moment. So when we say it's the most flood prone place, that's based on the data that we have. And it's not that we're studying every potential flood prone place in the state. I would say, in fact, maybe we started with the place we thought was very flood prone and we continue finding additional places that are actually more flood prone than the places we started. So yeah, just as a caveat, it's not that we have these sensors all up and down the state's coast.
Okay. Lauren?
I guess I'm the resident Down East voice. I live in Williston. My grandmother is in Davis. Jimmy Morris's the gauge and sea level is my ex-in-laws. I go there a lot to drop off my kids. So I deal with that flooding a lot, especially in the fall and winter time. But you get used to in Down East, and I learned it young with hurricanes. If a storm is bad in Cedar Island, it's not so bad in Davis. If it's bad in Davis, it's not so bad in Cedar Island. If it's bad, across the sound, it's not so bad. Irene did different than Florence, even though it was Down East. And I really think it's got a lot to do with where you're situated, and Down East kind of does this thing. So whether the wind's coming at you this way or that way, I think is one of the biggest drivers of how much flooding you get, because if a storm brings water from the Pamlico Sound, it's coming into Davis. Like it just drives it right in. And we have ditches, but they're full all the time because they've been, the water's just up. I can't say definitively why the water's up or how far it's going to go, but it's up and it keeps going up because I see it every day. So, but I do think where you're located in position to the ocean has a lot to do with how much flooding you get, and Beaufort's just different than Down East.
You can't dig a ditch deep enough to get rid of the water because all you're doing is releasing the groundwater. That's right. Thank you both very much. Appreciate it. Very informative. Next.
Yes. Last, Jennifer Dorton. Sorry, Jennifer, we're a little bit behind schedule, but thanks for being here, sticking around.
I can talk fast. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Jennifer Dorton. I work with the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association. We can shorten that to SOCORA, which is still a ridiculously long acronym. But when NOAA helps name you, that's kind of what you get sometimes. We're funded through, NOAA has different divisions. We fall under the National Ocean Service and specifically the Integrated Ocean Observing System, IOOS. IOOS has 11 regional associations across the country. SOCORA covers North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So we get both coasts of Florida up through to the North Carolina-Georgia border. Traditionally, SOCORA receives NOAA grants that cover a 5-year period, and we support universities, state agencies, private partners who install equipment in the water so that we can better understand what's happening offshore. That's everything from buoys to high-frequency radar to map surface currents to underwater gliders that help us better determine, does a hurricane have enough heat content available to help generate that storm and make it bigger. In 2021, we got thrown with a curveball a little bit. We had 4 different project teams apply to SOCORA for funding to look at the installation of low-cost water level sensors. How do we start filling in some of these gaps between these NOAA sensors? There's big gaps. For the coast of Georgia, they have 1 NOAA tide gauge. North Carolina, fortunately, we have 4, but it's really hard for somebody to see what's happening in Beaufort and know what that means in Cedar Island. So how do we start getting hyper-local? So we had 4 project teams who all looked at trying to do this across the Southeast. Each sort of was working in one state. So we pulled them all together and said, how do we create this network? So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Next slide, please. So those 4 teams are comprised of the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. You may know those folks. They work very closely with North Carolina Byway to support, dredging and beach nourishment. They're working with their partner. I was going fast, but not that fast. Whoever moved it on me. They're working with their partners with Ohonu to install water level sensors primarily in North Carolina, South Carolina, and a few in Florida. Georgia Tech is working very specifically in coastal Georgia. Coastal Carolina and Florida Atlantic University are working together in Florida and South Carolina. And FIU, Florida International, works really strategically in the Miami area. So these 4 teams, we pulled them together and we said, go forth and conquer. And then we had to pause. We had to hit pause real fast because we started realizing they had 4 different ways they were operating. So it wasn't like you could look at a Georgia Tech sensor and compare that data to what a Coastal Carolina sensor was doing. They were using the exact same sensors, but they had them set up totally different, and they had sampling rates totally different. So we got really quickly engaged with our partners at NOAA Co-ops, who are sort of the people that really know water level gauges. Even a low-cost sensor, you can still get really good data out of. So we had them help us develop some standard operating procedures, siting standards, maintenance and operation standards, survey standards. So we get everybody kind of working under the same umbrella. And then our Sea Grant partners have been fabulous in all 4 states. They're helping us identify communities where we need to install these sensors. They know the people on the ground. I don't. Socorro's like 6 people. So we don't know all the partners, but our Sea Grant folks do. So that's kind of our team that we've been working on. And I will say in North Carolina, I don't have a logo up there for them, but North Carolina Department of Public Safety, Gary Thompson's crew, they are phenomenal. They are phenomenal. So we're working very closely with them as well. Next slide. So we started off with network goals to provide really hyper-local water level data. As I said, these are lower cost sensors. So we're talking a sensor, when you look at the all burdened price, purchasing the sensor, assembling everything, getting it installed, and then your ongoing maintenance and surveying, you're looking at about a $5,000 to $7,000 investment. When you look at a NOAA gauge, you're talking $25,000 plus or minus. I mean, this is 250,000. Oh, I was off by an order of magnitude. At least $250,000. So these are vastly different than a NOAA gauge. They have a different level of accuracy, but it is at a level of accuracy that communities need. Yes, it can tell you, is your road flooded? It can tell you, do we have infrastructure that we need to consider blocking or, making sure that we limit access to. And that's really what we're doing, is we're really trying to fill these data gaps between these NOAA sensors. And we're truly trying to work strongly with, especially with underserved communities, to make sure that we're getting sensors in locations that are needed. In North Carolina, we just installed 2 sensors in Beaufort County, one in Belhaven and one over in Chocowinity, because their emergency management folks need to know, when do we need to start putting resources at locations when we think it's going to start flooding so we can get people out? We got to deal with ingress, egress issues. Help us plan for this. Hurricane Ophelia caught some of the Chocowinity folks off guard, so they were thrilled when this opportunity came up, and they were, everybody there was like, do you want our dock? Would you like access to our property? I mean, they were thrilled. It was great. We do have some challenges meeting demand. We have a lot of locations identified, but even at a $5,000 to $7,000 investment, it's still a lot of money when you start looking at the number of people. The other is balancing rigor with intent. And what I mean there is we have some folks, we have a 4-H group down in Georgia that wanted a sensor. That's great. You can put that sensor in and you can look at the height of the water below that sensor head. That's really all you're looking at. And for an education purpose, that's fine. But when we start looking at needing to know the height of the water relative to the surrounding land or our infrastructure, that requires surveying. That requires a better order, a stricter standard for how we manage that sensor. So in some cases, we're not really as worried about doing all the surveys if it's really, say, for an educational component versus how do we manage getting first responders in and out of a community. That's a whole different ballgame. Also, the operation and maintenance pieces and the repeatable survey procedures. All of those come with any infrastructure you're installing, whether it's offshore in the water or on land. Next slide. So our opportunities here, we're really leveraging expertise. So like I said, we work with Gary Thompson. I am not going to go anywhere and install a sensor before I pick up the phone and call Gary and say, what's your closest location? Because I don't want to be within 200 feet of you. That's ridiculous. So it's also really great when we can pick up the phone and call the NOAA folks and say, hey, I've got this issue. How do I get around it? Or give me some ideas. We're building partnerships with communities, not just our Sea Grant folks, but also with on-the-ground communities. We're really engaging our communities. There are Sea Grant folks. And as I said, we do have that collaboration with our co-ops teams. Next slide. So technology, for the most part, we are using ultrasonic water level sensors. Most of our folks are integrating solar panels on there, and that solar panel helps charge a battery, keeps your sensor going all the time. An ultrasonic sensor basically is emitting a sound. So it pulses down, it hits the water, the rate of return back up to the sensor lets it know where the water level is in relation to the sensor. Once we start surveying the sensors and we survey land elevation, we can start then looking at that water level data compared to the surrounding land. We can set up flood thresholds then. We've had a little bit of back and forth on these. Most everyone is using the exact same sensor, but that nose cone looks like it's really protective and great. It's amazing how many spiders get in there. And it's really amazing what spider webs do to your data when you start looking at it and you start seeing it bouncing everywhere and you're like, what is going on? And you go out there with a Leatherman and, you know, pull out this massive spider web, you realize really quickly what just happened. So in Belhaven, we actually went with a company called Synix and put two sensors in there. They actually hold up better in high wind conditions, and both those have high wind exposure, large fetch. And so we're really excited about that because it gets rid of the nose cone and does perform well in worse conditions. So next slide. Our survey partners were McKim & Creed. We did hire McKim & Creed to come out. As I mentioned, that rigor and intent. What is the station installed for allows us to know, do we actually go out and survey that location? At this moment, we have 98 sensors installed across 4 states. I think 18, I should know this, but I don't, I think it's 18 are in North Carolina. And we are looking to put more in North Carolina. But we only surveyed 67. Most of the ones we did not survey actually were in Florida and several in Georgia because they are very specific education components or citizen science components. It gives the information that they need for that location and it works for them, but they really didn't have to go through the process of surveying. And if anyone has worked with McKim & Creed, you'll know that it is not a cheap bill when you get it in the mail. So, you know, we have to deal with that as well. So next slide, please. So we did have all of our project team members go to Fernandina Beach. This location has a NOAA tide station. They had plenty of infrastructure for all of our folks to put their gauges. Each team put 1 or 2 sensors there. And then NOAA Co-ops is helping us do an evaluation of that sensor data against their station. So that's helping us also hone in on a few of our anomalies we're seeing. And I will say most of those have been with Coastal Carolina and the Florida Atlantic team. They kind of went a little bit different on their sampling schemes. So instead of doing a 1 second or 1 hertz sample, and then averaging to come up with your 6-minute sample like NOAA does. They were looking at like an 11-minute sample and it was like at a different rate. And we found out pretty quickly that that's really not appropriate. So we're kind of pulling them back into the fold. So that's also what bringing in those SOPs is really useful for, to get everybody marching to the same drummer. Next slide. In North Carolina specifically, we are closely collaborating with North Carolina Firemen. In those photos, you can see those, the one on the far right is Belhaven, the one on the left is Chocowinity. Gary's team actually came out and helped us do the surveys of those stations because he specifically wants to pull them into the Fireman network. That way he brings them into his emergency management, emergency planning. So that is a really close collaboration we are trying to foster. And also in North Carolina, this was when Socorro sort of spun a little bit and pivoted. Instead of working with one of our project team members to install these sensors, we decided we would take the responsibility of installing. So we worked with Greenstream Technologies. They also install the Feynman sensors. The Synix sensor is also used by Gary Thompson's shop. So it was a known sensor with known data quality and has been performance tested. And then Socorro hired a water level manager who's not here today. It was me, but now we've hired someone and I was thrilled. And he was one of the NOAA Co-ops field team. He is very experienced in going out, doing sensor installations, doing sensor maintenance, as well as doing all the surveying. So he can go back into those McKim & Creed marks that they set. He can go back and do all the resurveys annually. Excuse me. Again, we're working with our Sea Grant partners to help identify frontline and underserved communities. Our Hohonu team is great, our Hohonu at ESBPA. They, though, work a lot more with our beachside communities who then can pay for ongoing services later. We find that a lot of our underserved communities, Belhaven, they don't have a huge town budget to pay somebody an annual subscription fee to do the work. And I'm not trying to bash Hohonu, they just have a different business model. And we find that some of our underserved communities can't really afford that. So those are those communities that Socorro specifically is working with. We're taking on the responsibility of the long-term operation and maintenance of those stations. We want to make sure they're in there for the long haul. And then that's kind of gets to that third bullet. So next slide, please. So challenges, I've sort of hit most of these. It's that installation and maintenance standards, making sure everyone understands what it takes to keep these going. We are also trying to set up alerts for when water levels are getting high. You kind of see that on the NOAA gauges and a lot of other folks, you get to the minor and moderate flooding. But in a lot of places, there was never a NOAA gauge there. And we're kind of working with the community members to help identify what those flooding thresholds are. And that's another way we're trying to get the folks in the communities to give us feedback and really engage. And then, of course, over the long term, these sensors are going to help us track the number of repeat flooding instances annually. So we are kind of setting up a partner station situation where if it is a station like one of the non-67, we kind of pull them in as a partner station. And we have found that those are really exciting sometimes, where teachers will come in and say, hey, we're going to show everybody how to install this. So they take it down from one year and go in with their next classroom and they put it back out, which is great. It's a good learning experience, but they didn't necessarily put it exactly the same height that it was in the year before. So you kind of have to take some of these partner station ones with a little bit of a grain of salt, and we're trying to figure out how do we display that on a website so people understand this might not be the best for making decisions versus the one that are surveyed and maintained and are not moving. And then also presenting your data. NAVD 88, sort of the standard, and I don't know how much of y'all are in the weeds on geodesy, but that's going away. And, we keep hearing from Geodetic Survey that NAVD8 number is just, it's going to go away, and they have a new geodetic datum coming out. What is that going to be? And will people understand how to present that? So we're working through some of those issues. Next slide, please. So again, a little bit of a recap, but we do have 2 tiers of stations, Socorro and Partner. I'm going to show you a website that we're working on right now. We are all working with our Sea Grant folks to help us figure out how do people want this data? Websites are great, but what we have found from people my age and older is that the people my age and younger use everything on their phone. So how do we do it all mobile friendly? How do we do it so it's free, easy to access, mobile friendly? And for a lot of communities, it could be just a text alert. It's not even something you interface with. It's just sign up for a text alert and we'll let you know when water hits a certain level. So Sea Grant's helping us reach out to folks and see what that's going to look like. And then, as I said, our Socorro water level manager is going to be key to making all of this come to fruition and really making it work. And he's doing a great job already with our project team members now and our Sea Grant teams. Next slide. So this is just a quick look. You can see we have the ability to pull in the station data, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at this one and I can't see the screen because I'm not wearing my glasses that well. I think that's around Beaufort area, Jacksonville. And we pull in the water level data, but we also can run an algorithm behind it to look at predicted levels. And you can see it's tracking really well. We have one anomalous spike, and we can turn on quality control features for that. It would show up as the spike on the website too, if users are interested in getting like a flag when something's bad. This is a development site right now. We've been going back to Sea Grant folks. They're getting feedback from everybody. And actually, since this was made, we filled in the hole for the photos so people can actually see a photo representation. And then we have a little information blurb that's now been added to where we're going to start filling in details. This site's located at, and give an intersection and location. It's supported by, and more background info, sort of your metadata, if you will, on the station. Next slide. In some cases, we have the ability to pull in additional data. So in this one, this is Beaufort, South Carolina, and there's a DOT cam right next to where that water level sensor is. So we just went ahead and went from the DOT and started pulling in the camera data too. So now people have a visual to go with what they're seeing on that graph. In North Carolina, especially Beaufort, Soundside communities, they want wind speed, gust, and direction to go with any water level data. And that's great. We have a lot of experience doing that out in the ocean and putting sensors out on buoys. That sensor for a buoy living in the marine environment is way overkill for a community sensor that's on land. So we're trying to find some other partners, Weatherflow, and a few a few others that we're speaking to see if we can get some wind sensors installed, as well as some precip sensors. So that would be there in Bellhaven along with this sensor, and that gives them more data. As Catherine and Miyuki pointed out, that, you know, it's not just what's coming off the water, it's also that precip or the wind-driven components that we need to know. And that's really all I have. I don't have a lot of graphs. I just have the ones on our webpage. And next slide just gives you how to get in touch with me. I told you I'd be fast and speak quick. How'd I do?
You gave a lot of information. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very interesting concept of all the places that you have these gauges. Very much so. Any questions? Thank you. Very well.
Thank you. Y'all have a great night.
I'd like to thank each of our speakers this afternoon. There was an awful lot of information that we've got to absorb. And Dr. Moore, thank you so much to you and all your science panel. Y'all did a lot of work, and we all certainly appreciate it. Not just me, but all the rest of us up here appreciate it very much. And I'm sure we'll be asking you some more questions. Absolutely. Nothing else? We're going to adjourn. We'll see y'all back at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.